The Enigma of the Amigara Fault is a bonus chapter at the end of Junji Ito's 2002 book Gyo. The story follows a man named Owaki who decides to investigate a large fault that followed an earthquake on the slope of the Amigara mountain. Junji described the fault to be deep and several kilometers long and became the start of a strange incident. On his way to the Amigara Fault, he meets a girl named Yoshida and finds out that they are both looking for the same thing. However, as they started nearing their destination, they were surprised to find that there were others there as well. But what was even more bewildering was the fault itself. Upon entering the area, both the readers and characters are met with a daunting sight of human-esque shaped holes littering the sides of the fault. It is established in the story that everyone assumed these holes that emerged were thousands of years old. It couldn't have been possible otherwise. But for what reason? From observation, we could see that the holes do not just go straight, but in a sort of curve and almost maze-like path, making it impossible to properly understand. But there is something more eerie about these holes. Later on in the story, we find out that Yoshida, the girl Owaki met earlier in the story, came to look for the Amigara fault because she saw a glimpse of a hole in her silhouette. Absurd as it was, another man, Nagaki, came into their conversation, agreeing with her, claiming that most of them came for the exact same reason, and that they are all looking for their holes, and he finally found his. To prove his rationale, the man promptly disrobes himself and advances into a silhouette-shaped hole like a missing puzzle piece, perfectly fitting, perfectly unbothered, perfectly normal. And then, nothing. He kept going in the dark abyss, and no matter what anyone did, they were never able to find him. And that night, Owaki dreamed of Nagaki. Nowhere to go, the hole was so perfect that not a single limb can be moved, no head to turn, forced to keep on looking in the darkness of the void. And his cries for help, unheard. Despite knowing the consequences, in the following morning, more and more people started to mirror Nagakawa's descent, disrobing and climbing into their respective holes as if it was an automatic response. Yoshida too was able to find her hole, claiming that the silhouette is gaping at her, saying, come in to me, pleading, begging. In that following night, both Yoshida and Owaki too succumbed to the whispers of the Amigara fault. In his last final moments as he enters the hole, Owaki is highlighted as we, the readers, are shown a glimpse of the other holes above him, implying that those have already been occupied, and pretty soon, Owaki's silhouette too will be replaced at the bottom. It will keep eating, and more people will capitulate to the unforgiving hunger of the Amigara fault. At face value, in psychology, this story seems to symbolize the idea of the death drive or death instincts. For Sigmund Freud, he speaks of the death drive as a sort of primal destructiveness in the human psyche, and that the death instinct functions opposite of the life instinct. And for Bergman, the death drive is that of a motivator of behavior that pushes a person to think, talk, act, and dream in ways that they envisage the death of the person and or other people. In layman terms, death instinct or death drive is the instinctive desire for death as a means to alleviate anxiety or tension. A common example of this is when we often look down from heights, and for most people, this distance can cause a certain unease, and we often get the urge or thoughts of jumping as a way to assuage such discomfort. The characters in the Enigma of Amigara Fault are faced with the issue of knowing that going into those human-shaped holes means death, yet they still decided to go into them in an almost trance-like state. Heinz Kofut, on the other hand, believes that death or fear of death has nothing to do with biological instincts, but rather is caused by fear of loss of the relation to another who has an empathic understanding of the self. Perhaps we can assume that the characters in the story were unstable, and, for that reason, is why only after Yoshida disappeared that Owaki was convinced by the fault to participate in the end. Albeit the psychological aspect of the story, Junji Ito's Amigara fault hints at another tragedy, the Great Hanshin earthquake of 1995. For context, this story was published in 2002, 7 years after the incident in Japan. The Enigma of Amigara Fault opens with the line, "Not too long ago, there was a great earthquake in H Prefecture." On January 17, 1995, an earthquake of magnitude 6.9 hit the prefecture of Hyogo, Osaka, Kyoto, and Tokushima along the Nojima Fault. Kobe, a city in the Hyogo prefecture, suffered the greatest damage and categorized a level 7 for most devastation, which is the highest number possible on the Japan Meteorological Agency's seismic intensity scale. The death toll for Hyogo prefecture reached 5,480 out of the total 5,502 deaths. And of the total 1,209 homes destroyed in the earthquake, 99,232 were from Hyogo, thus causing about 99% of all the damage from the 1995 earthquake to be mostly concentrated in the Hyogo prefecture. Junji Ito's readers at the time would have experienced the tragedy as his mangas were more catered towards mature audiences, and that despite the 7 year gap, the event of the Great Hanshin earthquake would have still been fresh in the minds of the readers. The horror of the Enigma of the Amigara Fault isn't in the omnipotent power of the wall entrancing people in, it is in the claustrophobic environment of the human-like holes that is the true horror. In the collapse of the buildings, if one doesn't immediately die underneath the rubble, they become exposed to enclosed environments. And like those who disappeared in the Amigara Fault, victims of the 1995 earthquake were forced to survive in cramped dark spaces. And those who aren't immediately found succumb to enclosed areas with little to no wiggle room. And if not found, with limited air, they would perish. Underneath the rubble, those whose bodies were discovered could have perhaps been unrecognizable, damaged by the collapsed rubble. Trapped in their buildings and homes, these once places of solace became their own tomb. And just like Nagaki, their calls for help were unheard, unnoticed, silent. In the end of the story, the victims of the Amigara Fault became almost unrecognizable, their limbs contorting in all sorts of direction in an almost needle-like fashion, stretched by the shape of the holes, and their voices foreign. Like the story, the Great Hanshin earthquake had no tangible villain. There was no one to blame. It was a natural disaster that no human could have prevented. It was inevitable. And just like how there was a hole for everyone in that fault, death came to all.